During the reign of King Artaxerxes, at a time we would know of in the Western world of Socrates, the temple had been rebuilt. Jerusalem itself was in shambles, but the temple had been built, but there was nothing in the temple. Remember, it had been looted. And King Artaxerxes sent the prophet and priest Ezra with wealth and beauty to restore worship in the temple of God. Ezra goes to the temple and meets a significant question. Who should worship here? Should it be all people? Now, Haggai had originally said no. Now Ezra faces it again and he says, wait a minute. It is for the Jewish people. We would wish he had done otherwise, but I think there was a reason for it. You see, the people of God were beginning to worship, but they were lax in their habits. And as a consequence, their witness had been significantly compromised. So Ezra will in fact call them, as Haggai and Zechariah had done, to refocus on the clarity of their witness. It's interesting that Haggai is the first one who says, no, this is just for Jews. He's also the first one then to open it up and say there will be a time when all peoples everywhere will come and worship. Ezra, I think, has something similar in mind. It's the clarity of the witness that is important. Later, Nehemiah, that great leader in the Old Testament, will be sent by the king. Nehemiah, cupbearer to the king, will come back. The temple now is worthy of worship, but the city walls have been left alone, plundered, destroyed. It'd be like an open door to an art museum saying, come and take what you will. Nehemiah begins to rebuild the walls. Nehemiah will eventually rebuild the walls because of his remarkable leadership. First, he surveys it for himself. Secondly, he recruits family members to guard and work so that they're willing to fight, not just for the nation, which is not even really a nation yet, but for their families. And then, once the wall is rebuilt, the enemies seem to just fade away. But the work of God isn't done, because the final prophet in the Old Testament is Malachi. We don't know much about Malachi. What we do know is that Malachi said, God has provided this wonderful place for us, and yet abuse is occurring. Abuse by priests, abuse by lay people. Malachi calls for the integrity of faith. You may remember Malachi is the one who said, I, the Lord, do not change, so you descendants of Jacob are not destroyed. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. But you ask, how are we to return? Will a mere mortal rob God? And yet you rob me. But how are we robbing you, you ask? In tithes and offerings you're under a curse, your whole nation, because you're robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven. Isn't it interesting? Martin Luther said the last thing converted about anybody is, well, their pocketbook. And now, the temple rebuilt, the city walls have been restored, the city and its population are reestablished, and they cheat God and refuse to give. Raises a question, doesn't it? In the midst of prosperity, do we still look to God? What do you think about tithing? At St. Mark, we teach tithing of the income we receive, take home. Do you believe it's biblically commanded? Or is Malachi simply an Old Testament prophet for an Old Testament people? Malachi is also the one who first announces that there will be one who goes before the Messiah. Elijah will come. And of course, from that prophecy, the New Testament begins with the narrative in ministry of John the Baptist. We're about ready to pivot and move from God's work in the Old Testament to God's work in the promised Messiah. Happy reading.